Hi everyone. Sorry for the delay there this morning. We were having some technical issues here at headquarters. Welcome to the second session of our forecasting UAE GDP event. My name is PJ and I'm joined with my colleague Rodrigo. We work for a small consulting firm headquarters here in Abu Dhabi, UAE, and we also have a presence in other places like London and Australia. Thanks for joining us, or thanks for watching this at some later date. It is our pleasure to share with you some of the work that we have done on UAE's GDP, particularly from a forecasting standpoint. We do work in other sectors as well. A lot of work in utilities and climate and sustainability, things like price controls, financial models, raising finance, and helping people further their business interests, either on the investor side or from the government side as well. So today we're going to cover one of the specific models that we have created for UAE CDP. We call it an ARIMA model, and we'll go into detail on this particular version. On the previous session, if you haven't had a look at that yet, we recommend starting there, where we introduce some of the data that we collected, some of the motivations that we had for this project, and some of the preparatory work that led into this type of model. So it feels like there's a huge growth, and there is a huge growth in the region, and there's obviously a huge interest in GDP, both inside the Emirate of Abu Dhabi and the United Emirates generally, but also from investors outside the Emirate as well. And what we're trying to do is bring a lot more transparency to that information, some of which is geo-blocked. We will say so. If you're sitting there quite confused about what's happening, we might be able to help you, and this session will be able to help you as well. But also from a technical standpoint, you might be interested in where the UAE's GDP may go over the coming months and quarters. And hence, as economists and consultants, you're very welcome to learn and to find out more about this topic today. So on the second slide, we introduce what we call an ARIMA model. It stands for autoregressive integrated moving average. It's an econometric technique that is quite successful and quite popular, and it is one of the first types of models that we used on the data that we collected to forecast the GDP of the UAE. It's a popular technique for this challenge and this topic, and we want to share today not just why we tried that model, but exactly how we tried it. There's different versions, there's different types of ARIMA model, and there's different preparatory work and data that can be used for that model. It is the first successful one, we will say, that we used for the topic of forecasting UAE GDP. And we say successful, what we mean here is that it had good accuracy. It had some good insights on where the GDP would go when we built trial models and tested them on real. We tested actual forecasts on real outturn data, and there was a pretty good relationship there in terms of accuracy. So I'll just hand over to Rodrigo for slide 3, unless, Rodrigo, you have any questions you want to raise there on slide 2 before we move on.
hmm Oh, I think you were very thorough on this slide. No questions so far. So, just for a quick background, what is an ARIMA model? Because sometimes these things can be very um, uh, can be too technical sometimes. So, as PJ said, it's an autoregressive integrated moving average model. So ARIMA or ARIMA. Um, Usually it's represented by ARIMA, and then in parentheses P, D, and Q. So P is what we call the autoregressive order, which just means the number of lags of a variable, in our case here GDP, that impact current GDP. So for example, when p equals to 1, that means that the GDP of the immediately previous period affects current GDP. For instance, let's think of the GDP in 2023. It would be affected by the GDP of 2022. If p equals to 2, that means that we are going 2 years further, so or 2 years back. So we say that there are two legs, uh, and so on. Then we go to the integration order, which is shown by the letter D. The integration order is the number of times that our variable, in our case GDP, is differenced. What that means is essentially um, the variation between one period and the other is what we're measuring when d equals to 1, where we take the first difference. In our case here, we used we did a little transformations on GDP, so we're actually talking, so when we're talking about the first difference, we're actually talking about the percentage change. So what you see in the news about GDP growing x%, that's what we're using here in our model. And then the third component, which is the moving average order measured by Q, it's analogous to the AR portion, but it's applied to the error terms. So here we're saying that the random variations that happened in previous periods are affecting GDP nowadays. So if you had, for example, a crisis happening the year before, that crisis probably affects current GDP in a way, or in one way or another. So that's also something that we integrate in the model. So all of these components, all of these three parts, let's say, of the ARIMA model, they have a lot of background from academia, especially when it comes to GDP. There's an intensive body of work that explores how these components affect GDP. There are some variations of the ARIMA model that we're not going to get into here because we know that it's outside of the scope of this current model that we are presenting. But we can include a seasonal component, so it would be a seasonal ARIMA or SARIMA. We can also include other explanatory variables in the ARIMA, to which then becomes called ARIMA X or ARIMAX. So that's also another variation that we have tried as well. Um, but then we ended up landing on this ARIMA model, which was the one that had, again, the best accuracy out of the other ones that we've tried. So under here, I underscored the notation, so ARIMA PDQ. That way, it makes it easy for us to understand how what each of these numbers that we're going to see represent.
And Rodrigo, on the first session last week, we talked about the ARIMA model and we talked about what we call the macro model, and we might have mentioned some machine learning models and VAR models and things like this. Is there any? Could you give us a quick view on how the ARIMA differs to the other ones, the other techniques that we discussed in terms of maybe benefits and drawbacks?
hmm Yeah, so the ARIMA model has this big benefit that essentially none of the other models that we have tried have, which is it only takes one variable. We only need the GDP information to be able to run the model, and then for forecasting. So not only is estimating this model fairly straightforward, but also keeping it updated becomes much easier and much more efficient, let's say, when we compare to other types of models, simply because whenever there's a new GDP data that comes out, we just include that in our database and then run the model again, and now we have an updated forecast for the current period or the future periods. Whereas when we go to a macro model or a VAR model, or even a machine learning model, we are using a, a great number of other variables, and sometimes these variables take a bit longer to be updated, and then you also have to keep up sometimes with multiple data sources. So for example, in our macro model, which we'll talk about less next week, giving already a sneak peek here, we use model from different data sources. So To keep the model updated, you have to keep up with two, three different entities and their schedules of publishing their data collection. So all of that makes it a bit more work intensive to run and keep up with those models, and that's the big advantage of the ARIMA over these other estimations.
And in terms of the disadvantage or downside, let's say.
Well, every model is going to have their upsides and downsides. The ARIMA model, what for us ended up being the biggest downside was that we couldn't do scenario testing. So we know that there are many other variables that affect GDP. GDP doesn't exist on its own. So if we wanted to estimate, let's say, how a period of high inflation could impact GDP, we would not be able to do that. So the ARIMA model has this, um, let's say, rigidity that ends up ended up being an issue, at least for us, for um, our purpose of estimating and forecasting GDP model. We didn't just want to say, okay, what do we think GDP is going to be? We also wanted to say, okay, if some conditions change and we can put these new conditions in the model, what now do we think GDP is going to be?
Yep. Very good. Very
Yeah.
interesting. Very interesting.
And
Yeah.
just if I may just say one
Yep.
last thing. Again, like I said, all of this is very technical, especially what I brought again about the seasonal REMA and the REMA X. We talked about VAR model now here too. So if you want to know more about this, we do have a series on econometrics in Eventbrite. So feel free to go there and check it out. We delve into much more detail, not only on these time series models, but also on other econometric estimations as well. We talk about not only time series, but we also talk about cross-section models. We talk about panel models, um, any other types of estimations, and we are always improving our courses and adding new content. So feel free to go check it out if you're interested in all this econometric area. I personally really like it. It's very it's the area that I love working with. So yeah, feel
Yep.
free to go there and check it out.
Good shade. Good shade. Excellent. And so on the slide 4 here, we talk about we there's a good precursor what we just discussed there in terms of the rationale behind the ARIMA model, and so it's actually quite well proven in econometric studies that ARIMA models are effective in forecasting GDP, and actually not just GDP, but things like inflation and other macroeconomic variables. It's a very popular model, so it's very well agreed, well established, and well founded that ARIMA has some good forecasting capabilities. And secondly, there is some intuition as well in terms of GDP itself naturally has peaks and troughs and cycles, and so you might understand that although there is only one variable in there, GDP itself, in the ARIMA model, you can quickly see that actually GDP next year and following years is probably quite closely related to what's happened in the most recent years for GDP. And so that itself is telling you that GDP itself is one of the best ways to forecast GDP in the future. And so there's natural cycles and rhythms and speeds that are baked in there to the model. What I will say is that obviously Rodrigo will go into this in a bit more detail, but the model is created based on UAE data, Abu Dhabi data, some of which is actually quite hard to find, quite hard to source, geo blocked if you're not in the region. And also, we did some preparation work by harmonizing the price base, standardizing the price base to strip out inflation and make it more consistent over time, which is one of the reasons why we've ended up with some good results in the end that we believe. So yeah, the secondary lagged effects there as well that I just mentioned are going to be nice and clean because of that preparation work and data gathering work that we did there to begin with. And so yes, the third part there, it only requires one variable, so it is simple, that, as Rodrigo mentioned, to update over time, and as soon as you have some GDP information, new information on outturns, you can then forecast some new further point in the future, be that quarterly or annually. And Rodrigo will tell us about the annual model that we created, but the same principles apply to quarterly models and other slices of periods of time. So all of this applies to those different variations of ARIMA. Um, so yeah, happy. If there anything else I should cover here, Rodrigo?
Mhm. Just one thing. So we talk here about how some of the future GDP can be affected by what's happening today. What are some channels that can happen? How can GDP affect? How can past GDP affect current GDP?
Yeah, so what can happen is that if there's a big investment in the economy and an increase in production this year, what that might reflect is that there's new factories, there's new businesses, there's new types of investment and new types of labor coming into the region. And what that does is, because that's in the region and happened last year, it will naturally lead to similar types of impact and similar types of levels of GDP or GDP growth in future periods and future years. So GDP itself it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can bring it to a new level, then you might be at that level or further from there on. And that applies not just in terms of the difference series and the growth series, but also the speed of growth and the level of GDP growth. And maybe one thing I should mention here as well that's quite useful for the for the ARIMA model as well is that sometimes what happens, especially in this region, the UAE, outturn data gets revised. So you might believe you have an outturn right now for GDP for 2023, let's say. But then in 2024, they might change that outturn because it was a best estimate at the time. And so we would update our models for the latest information that might be different from the first collection exercise on GDP outturn. So that's one of the features that it gets refreshed, not just for the latest outturn, but maybe some of the previous outturns which might have been revised upwards or downwards.
Hmm. Right. So for this model that we have run, we ended up going with the specification ARIMA 111, which means we used one leg of GDP. We used the first differencing of GDP, and we also used one leg of the error term. So our AR, our I, and our MA components were all equal to one. Of course, that was not just a decision based on what we thought would be or based on guessing or anything of the sort. We did do many statistical tests. We try different types of specifications as well. Sometimes, if you work with econometrics, if you're familiar with this whole model estimation process, sometimes there is a little bit of trial and error. You have to estimate. You may think you have found the best specification, but you still want to try some variations just to make sure that you do have the best specification. So we've done all of that work. The first difference here on GDP, here we use the simplification to show in the model just so that it doesn't become too convoluted. But our first difference here of GDP was actually the first difference, was actually the percentage change of GDP. So it would be closer to the first difference of the natural log of GDP. So that's just a little parenthesis that I would like to make. So this is again a bit of a simplification, but ended up that this was our end model. So we have an alpha component here that it's very close to zero. We have the beta one with the variation of GDP of the first leg of GDP, and then we have the error term and the first leg of the error term. So why do we take this first difference? Is for our series to become stationary, which um, a very high level just means that we don't have a tendency in our variable. So by eliminating this tendency, we also eliminate the bias within the model. Again, if you want to know with a little bit more in detail, please check our econometric series. Um, One of the statistical tests that we have done is a visual test that is very widely used in the literature, which is the looking at the partial autocorrelation function and the autocorrelation function to determine which are the best levels of P and Q. In our case, both of these functions show them to be equal to zero. And now here, just a couple of things that we should say. So first off, the partial autocorrelation function and the autocorrelation function. Again, if you're familiar, you'll know that they're not absolute indicators of the specification of an ARIMA model. So those are not the only things that we should follow in order to estimate our best model. So naturally, we have done other statistical tests as well in our data and in our ARIMA model to make sure that we had the best possible specification. And then, of course, if we were to use P and Q to be equal to zero, then we would end up with simply a random walk model, and that you can't really predict anything with a random walk model, because at that point you're just saying that all the movements are completely random. So we used P and Q equal to 1 in order to be able to run the ARIMA model. And like I said, again, we did perform other tests to make sure that we were not biasing our model, and we were not incurring in an error by using this estimation of P and Q equal to 1. And so for the estimation of the model, the training period that we used was from 1975 to 2017. So since the earliest GDP data that we've had until 2017, so that we could do a forecasting period of 2018 and 2022, which is what we used to measure our met to measure our initial accuracy metrics, our initial mean average errors, and other accuracy metrics.
Yep. Yeah, and it's fair to say we did an annual. This was annual data that we were working with, and
Mhm.
the 111 specification reflected the statistical tests on that training period and on that annual data. But it might have changed, Rodrigo, if we would have used quarterly data for a more recent, like say 20, 10 or 20 years worth of quarterly data. Yeah.
Yeah, so most likely it would change. We are actually working now at a quarterly model as well. So we plan on rolling that out as soon as we have some good, robust results. But it is, I would say, it is even expected that it would not be in ARIMA with these specifications, simply because at an annual model, what we're saying is that 1 year affects the next year. And in a quarterly model, we're talking about how 1 quarter affects another one. So if we think that GDP has an effect of 1 year on another, it's natural to assume that we're going to have on quarterly data, we have 4 quarters at least affecting, or 4 quarters past affecting the current quarter. So it's to be expected that we're going to have either a seasonal ARIMA, which means that, let's say, we'll have our current GDP being affected by the previous quarter and the same quarter of the previous year. So if we're estimating, let's say right now we're finishing the third quarter of 2024. So if we're estimating this quarter, it means that it would be affected by the second quarter of 2024 and the third quarter of 2023. So that would be one of the examples of what we might see. We might have as well more than one quarter affecting our GDP. So let's say if the previous 2 quarters, so the first and the second ones. So there are many different possibilities in terms of specifications. But yeah, we should not expect actually our ARIMA model to also be 111 when using a quarterly specification, especially given the results that we have had with this annual model.
Yep. And that's a very good reminder of the data driving the type of model, the specification of the model, and the preferred model in each case, which is one of the reasons why these exercises take a bit of effort and take a bit of trial and error, because you're trying to get the most information out of the relevant data, whatever that might be. If it's quarterly, that's obviously different types of data
Hmm.
than annual. Yep, yep, very good. And that leads us nicely into why we were using an annual model to begin with, actually, and some of the results that we were getting, and the forecasting power that we believe we found in that space. One of the reasons why we used an annual model was because we had something to compare to. We had other entities who were trying to do the same thing that we were trying to do, which is forecast next year's GDP and up to 5 years ahead GDP. One of those other entities is called the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and another entity actually locally was called the Central Bank of the UAE. And so we wanted to see if we could beat those guys, do a better job, be more accurate than those guys. And that was the challenge that we set ourselves as a team. We had the information from those other entities about what they forecast GDP would have been using presumably their models. And so this was a good test for us to see, can we find something that's more valuable, more accurate for forecasting GDP? Can we beat the IMF, be more accurate than they are? Can we beat the Central Bank of the UAE? Can we be more accurate than they are? And of course, we're delighted to say that, as we show on the slide here, our forecast error has been smaller than the IMF that we show on the slide here, but also the central bank as well of the UAE. We wouldn't say that that's always going to be the case. There's definitely going to be times where they might have a more accurate forecast than we have. But what we actually did do in our work, and it's not easy to show that on the slide here, we did rolling forecasts. So we kept repeating the the forecasting exercise for each year in the past, using only data up to that point prior to that date and time. What this allowed us to do was to check whether we could not be more accurate than the IMF and the UAE Central Bank just once, but whether we could be more accurate than the IMF and the central bank more than once, more often than not. Maybe not every time, but most of the time. And that was the challenge. So it's not just be more accurate on a one-off basis one year. One swallow doesn't make a summer, they would say in Ireland. But can we be more accurate more often than not compared to the next best piece of evidence that's out there? So that's what we're saying here when we say we've got good forecasting power here in this model. And we give an example for the year 2023 when we forecast using this model 3.85%. And the IMF forecast 4.2%, and we have a little hyperlink there to take you to the source there. And then the actual growth turned out to be 3.62%. So you can see that we were 0.23% away from the actual outturn number. You can also see that the IMF were 0.6% away. So both our forecast and the IMF were above the actual GDP growth, but ours was not that much further above compared to the IMF. So that's what we're saying on this slide.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity here, um, we did estimate the ARIMA model for total GDP. Did we try other estimations of ARIMAs for example, non-oil GDP or sectoral, or how was that work?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Rodrigo. We did try I think there was 13 different sectors that we had GDP information for, and depending on the relevant period of time, it was split up differently by the statistical agencies and the other sources of information where we were gathering GDP. But yes, we did try individual sectors, and we found pretty good results for quite a few sectors. But I think what our results were also showing was that our primary objective was total GDP, overall GDP, and not just GDP from one individual sector. So we were finding decent results. I think from memory they were slightly better for total GDP, because I remember thinking, yeah, sometimes the sectors offset each other, something, and there would be natural diversification within the different sectors. When one sector does well, another sector might not do so well, and so it was little bit harder to forecast individual sectors. I recall from memory.
Hmm. That sounds good. Okay, so we have shown so far how our model worked, why it was with we believe it was a good model, how it was an accurate model. So why did we decide to go for a different model? Why did we just didn't say, okay, we found a good enough model, let's just stick with it and be done with this? So there are a few different reasons. First, of course, as we pointed out before, we wanted to be able to draw scenarios. We wanted to be able to make these different estimations, given different potential economic conditions. So that one was a big driver for us. Um, we already had access to the data that we could use in these different models, so we already had all of that in our database. So it was only natural that we would try also new models. We believed that this extra data that we'd have could improve accuracy. So we do believe that there are other factors that we can account for aside from GDP that affect GDP and can help us predict it. So in the end, we knew that with our data, with our expertise, with our economic knowledge, we knew that we could do an even better model than this ARIMA that we had estimated. So that's that's essentially those are the main reasons why we decided to keep pursuing different types of model and different types of approaches to estimating and forecasting GDP.
And it's maybe fair to say, Rodrigo, on that first point there, this scenario one, there's a similar point around interpretability and explainability as well, isn't there? Because some clients ask us not just where the GDP might go and what it might be in next year and up to 5 years ahead, but they also want to know why that's the case. You know, why do we think GDP will go to 4% or 2% or some other number? And it's not that satisfactory for us to say just because the ARIMA model said so. It's better for everyone to be able to say, well, we think that's because there's more investment. We think that's because there's lower unemployment. There's higher or lower interest rates. We saw an interest rate reduction yesterday. What does that do for GDP? And to be able to base their decisions on that, and to understand why the GDP might go in different directions. So that scenario driven one is a pretty important one if you're a government entity or a decision maker or an investor or a business. You want to know not just where it's going and what level, but why and what that means for you as a business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, very good. I think we're finishing just about on time, maybe slightly over. But if anyone
Mhm.
has any questions, feel free to contact us. We have some details on the slide here. Myself and Rodrigo would be happy to help. We're based in ADGM most of the time, and today was all about ARIMA.
Mhm.
Rodrigo mentioned that if you want some more technical information, we do have a course on Eventbrite, multiple courses on Eventbrite on econometrics. We also have courses on GDP itself, just understanding the variable. How do you define that? How do you measure that? Does it really mean something for me or as a business investor or as a government entity? So we've courses on GDP. We also have the as alongside the courses, we provide the quizzes and we provide a transcript which we can translate into Arabic and different languages as well. If that's of interest, do reach out. We're very happy to share our knowledge in this space and educate yourself or your firms in this area. So yeah, that's maybe all for now, I think. But feel free to keep an eye on the series. We'll be having another event next Thursday. We'll be going to another type of model and explain what we did there. So thanks for watching and thanks for joining us today. My pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much. Until next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye bye.